My name is Jack, and I am standing in the doorway of a house that is no longer mine. The key in my hand feels like a ghost of a welcome that no longer exists. Now, it's nothing more than cold metal. In front of me, a smug, perfectly manicured woman is directing movers. That woman is my Aunt Carol. She's pointing at my grandfather's handcrafted armchair, the one with the worn leather, and telling the movers to be careful with it. "That one's a genuine antique," she says, her voice dripping with fake refinement. "It'll fetch a lovely price." She sees me and her smile widens, but it doesn't reach her eyes. Her eyes are polished stones, hard, cold, and unreadable. "Jack, dear," she coos, walking over. "I'm so glad you came to see the old place one last time. It's for the best, you know. A fresh start." The eviction notice in my pocket feels like a block of ice against my leg. My fresh start was a cramped one-bedroom across town, while she dismantled my entire life piece by piece. I didn't say a word. I just looked past her, at the main support beam in the center of the living room. Solid oak, cut from a forest that doesn't even exist anymore. It held the house together, but it held something else too. Carol thought she'd stolen my grandmother's legacy, but she had no idea that this place carried a history even she couldn't erase. A secret that would turn her victory into a spectacular, crushing defeat. Carol thought she held all the cards, but I had built the table she was playing on. That house wasn't just wood and nails. It was my whole world. I was raised there by my grandmother Eleanor after my parents passed away when I was young. Grandma Eleanor was the kind of woman who radiated a gentle and comforting warmth. She taught me that your hands were your most valuable tools, a lesson my grandfather had taught her. He was a master carpenter, and his workshop in the garage became my sanctuary. While other kids were playing video games, I was learning the language of wood, the stubbornness of oak, the forgiveness of pine. I spent years restoring that house with my own two hands, under my grandmother's watchful eye. Every floorboard I replaced, every wall I painted, was a conversation with my past. My Aunt Carol, my grandmother's only other child, was a different story. She lived in the city and would visit maybe twice a year, always dressed in clothes that cost more than our monthly grocery bill. She'd walk through the house with a polite, tight smile, calling everything charming and rustic, which I later learned was her code for old and worth money. I saw it, but my grandmother, bless her heart, only saw her daughter. She couldn't believe anyone, especially her own child, could be motivated by anything other than love. I was just a kid, so I pushed my suspicions down. I chose to believe in the family my grandmother saw, not the one that was festering right under our noses. I never imagined that Carol wasn't just visiting. She was scouting, assessing her future assets, waiting for the one person who stood in her way to finally be gone. A month after my grandmother's funeral, the letter arrived. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, requesting my presence for the reading of the final trust documents. I went, of course, assuming it was a formality. I found myself in a sterile, mahogany-paneled office, sitting across from a slick-looking lawyer and my Aunt Carol, who was dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies, cleared his throat and began to read. It all sounded standard at first, legacies to charities, personal items left to friends. Then he got to the house. He read a clause I had never known existed. My grandmother had apparently set up a complex trust years ago, and a recent amendment, signed just 6 months before she passed, stipulated something horrifying. It said that if the property's maintenance costs were projected to exceed a certain percentage of its value, full control of the asset would be transferred to the more financially solvent heir to ensure the estate's preservation. That, of course, was Carol. She produced a stack of documents, inflated quotes from contractors she knew, a biased property assessment. It was a perfectly legal, perfectly evil trap. "I'm so sorry, Jack," Carol said, her voice a perfect imitation of grief. "I had no idea Mother was so worried. But don't you worry. I'll take care of everything. You can stay for a few weeks to get your things in order." The lawyer slid the eviction notice across the table. It was already filled out. My grandmother, who could barely work her television remote, had supposedly orchestrated this complex financial maneuver. I knew then and there it was a lie. Carol had manipulated her, preying on her fears of being a burden, and had stolen my entire world right out from under me. I walked out of that office numb, the city sounds around me muffled like I was underwater. Just hours earlier, I had carried my grandmother's photograph in my pocket like a shield, believing in the promise she made when I was 16. This house will always be yours, Jack. It's where you belong. Those words rang in my head like a cruel joke as Carol dabbed fake tears inside. Outside, strangers hurried past with shopping bags and phones, unaware that my entire world had been dismantled inside that paneled room. I felt like a ghost, cut off from the only home that had ever given me life. The weeks that followed were hell on earth. I felt a cold, hard knot of anger in my stomach that never went away. I tried talking to a lawyer, a local guy who patted my shoulder and told me that fighting a trust like this was like trying to punch a ghost. It would drain my savings and, in all likelihood, fail. "The documents are signed and notarized, son," he'd said with a sigh. "It's airtight." My friends tried to help. "Maybe it's a blessing in disguise," my friend Dave offered, trying to be positive. "A chance for a fresh start." But how could I start fresh when my roots had been ripped out of the ground? The house was my identity. I was the boy who lived in the old Peterson place, the grandson of the carpenter. Who was I now? Just some guy renting a sad, beige apartment that smelled like stale cigarettes. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the injustice of it all eating me alive. I felt powerless, a child again, watching a monster take everything I loved. Is it even worth fighting? The question echoed in the empty rooms of my new life. If I gave up, she won. If I fought, I looked like a fool. Either way, I was losing. I was completely and utterly alone. But then, one night, as I was unpacking the last box of my grandmother's things, I found her old journal. Tucked inside was a faded photograph of her and my grandfather standing in front of the house, right after they'd finished the frame. On the back, in her familiar, looping script, she had written, "A home's true strength isn't in the walls, but in the heart that holds it all together. And our heart, my dear Jack, has a secret. A flicker of something that wasn't despair ignited within me." Grandma's words became my mantra. I started digging, not through law books, but through memories. I combed through old blueprints my grandfather had drawn, and boxes of my grandmother's letters and receipts. And then I found it. It was a letter from our old neighbor, Mr. Henderson, dated just a week after Carol claimed the trust was amended. In the letter, Mr. Henderson mentioned a conversation he'd had with my grandmother over the fence. She had told him, clear as day, "I'm making sure Jack is the only one who will ever be the keeper of this house. He's its heart now." It wasn't a legal document, but it was proof of intent. My hands were shaking as I called my lawyer. For the first time, he sounded hopeful. He arranged a meeting with Carol and Mr. Davies. I walked into that office feeling 10 feet tall. I presented the letter, watching as the color drained from Carol's face. For a single, beautiful moment, I saw genuine panic in her eyes. She knew she was caught in a lie, but the victory was short-lived. Mr. Davies, ever the professional snake, simply steepled his fingers and smiled. "A lovely sentiment," he said coolly, "but hearsay from a neighbor doesn't override a signed, legally binding document." He pushed the letter aside with a smirk, as if it were nothing but trash. The small hope I'd had was extinguished. Then came the bigger blow. To add insult to injury, Carol slid a check across the table. It was for $5,000. "For your troubles, dear," she said. That smug mask snapped right back into place. "To help you get on your feet. No one can say I'm not generous." It wasn't kindness. It was the public beheading of my pride, a final stamp on her victory. I left the check on the table and walked out, the sound of her condescending laughter following me down the hall. The day of the eviction was gray and cold, a perfect match for the hollowness in my chest. A moving truck was parked on the lawn, its back open like a hungry mouth, ready to swallow my life. Carol was there, of course, orchestrating the whole thing like a movie director. She'd even invited a reporter from the local paper, spinning a story about how she was rescuing her family's historic home from disrepair. I was being painted as the irresponsible nephew who couldn't handle the upkeep. Neighbors I'd known my whole life watched from their porches, their faces a mixture of pity and curiosity. It was the ultimate humiliation. Every box that came out of that house felt like a piece of me being torn away. My grandfather's tools, my childhood drawings, the quilt my grandmother made. I saw one of the movers carelessly toss a box labeled photos, and something inside me just broke. I had lost. Completely. I spent that night on Dave's couch, listening to the rain hit the window. My phone buzzed. It was a link to a real estate website. Dave had sent it with the message, "I'm so sorry, man." There it was. My house. My home. It was already listed for sale, for a price that was 5 times what Carol had claimed it was worth in her assessment. The description was filled with lies. Lovingly preserved, historic gem. Perfect for commercial development. She wasn't preserving a legacy. She was flipping it for a massive profit to a developer she was clearly already in business with. That was the final twist of the knife. It wasn't just about the house. It was about pure, unadulterated greed. I was officially at rock bottom with nothing left to lose. There's a strange clarity that comes with hitting rock bottom. When you have nothing to fear. I sat there on that lumpy couch, the glow of the real estate listing lighting up my face, and I didn't feel sadness anymore. I felt a cold, quiet rage. I thought about my grandmother's note again. A home's true strength isn't in the walls, but in the heart that holds it all together. I had thought she meant a physical secret, a trick hidden in the wood. But now I realized I had been thinking like a carpenter, not like her grandson. Her strength wasn't in tricks. It was in her love for legacy, for history. Grandma Eleanor was the town's unofficial historian. Her passion was preserving the stories that made our small town of Maple Creek what it was. And then it hit me, not like lightning, but like the slow, powerful dawn. I went to the last box of her things I had yet to unpack, the one labeled Town Archives. Inside, beneath maps and old newspaper clippings, was a thick leather-bound folder. The title on it read, "Application for Historic Landmark Designation, the Peterson House." My hands trembled as I opened it. It was full of her meticulous research. She had documented everything. The rare, old-growth oak used for the frame, timber that came from a forest that no longer existed, the unique joinery techniques my grandfather used, a style that had died out with his generation, the fact that our living room had hosted the town's first-ever council meeting in 1895. She had started the application years ago but had set it aside, worried the designation might make it harder for me to sell someday if I needed to. The irony was crushing. The very thing she feared would be a burden was now my only weapon. My rage turned into a plan. I wasn't going to fight Carol with a secret trick. I was going to fight her with the undeniable weight of history itself. My confidence returned, not as a flood, but as a slow, steady tide. My plan was audacious and perfectly legal. Carol's deal with the developer was to turn the property into a commercial space, which would require massive renovations, if not a complete teardown. A historical landmark designation would make that impossible. The property would become a protected piece of history, its value to a developer dropping to zero overnight. The key was timing. I had to get the designation approved before the sale closed. I spent every waking hour at the town hall, the library, and the county records office, transforming myself from a grieving craftsman into a determined historical advocate. I took my grandmother's file and built upon it, adding my own architectural analysis of the woodwork, providing sworn affidavits from older neighbors, and digging up photos from the town archives that proved the house's significance. I officially submitted the completed application to the Maple Creek Historical Preservation Committee. The nights bled into mornings as I hunched over stacks of brittle newspapers and cracked leather files in the library. My hands, once calloused from sanding oak, now throbbed from endless notes and late-night typing. Each discovery felt like my grandparents whispering through the dust. A council meeting photo on our porch in 1895, an article praising my grandfather's carpentry methods as the last of their kind. One evening, Mrs. Carter, the town librarian, approached quietly with a small box. "Your grandmother left this here years ago," she said. Inside were more photographs, annotated in her handwriting. Felt like she was still guiding me. Carol thought I was fighting alone, but the truth was clearer every day. I wasn't just defending a house. I was defending the soul of Maple Creek itself. Word got back to Carol, of course. She called me, her voice dripping with scorn. "A historical landmark? Honestly, Jack, this is pathetic. My lawyers have already looked into it. These things take years. The sale will be closed long before your little fantasy project ever gets to a vote." She saw it as a desperate, childish tantrum. That was her mistake. She underestimated my resolve, and more importantly, she underestimated the power of my grandmother's legacy in this town. She saw the house as an asset. I was about to prove it was a landmark. The historical committee, moved by the detailed application and the history of the Peterson family, fast-tracked the hearing. It was scheduled for the week before the sale was set to close. The meeting room at the town hall was packed. I saw Aunt Carol sitting in the front row with her slick lawyer and the developer, Mr. Hayes. They looked bored and arrogant, like this was just a minor inconvenience before they could cash their checks. They presented their case first, arguing that the designation would stifle economic growth and infringe on property rights. They painted me as a disgruntled relative trying to spite his family out of spite. They were polished, professional, and utterly soulless. Then it was my turn. I didn't just present the facts from the application. I told a story. I spoke of my grandfather, who put his soul into every joint and beam. I spoke of my grandmother, who loved the town's history more than anyone. I held up the old photos of town founders on our porch. I spoke of my own hands, working on the same wood my grandfather had shaped, feeling a connection across generations. "This isn't just a house," I said, my voice thick with emotion but steady and clear. "It's a living piece of Maple Creek's history. To destroy it for another strip mall would be to tear a page out of our town's soul." When I finished, the room was silent. I had not just presented a case. I had reminded the committee of who they were. They were neighbors, friends. They had known my grandmother. They voted. The designation was approved. Unanimously. Mr. Hayes, the developer, stood up immediately. He didn't even look at the committee. He looked straight at Carol, his face a mask of cold fury. "The deal is off," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Our agreement was for developable property. This is worthless to me." He turned and walked out. Carol's face went white. She was trapped. She had won the house, but I had just won the war, not with a trick, but with the truth. The fallout for Carol was catastrophic. The developer not only backed out but sued her for failing to disclose the pending historical application, claiming she had wasted his time and resources. She was now the owner of a priceless landmark that was, for her purposes, worthless. She couldn't alter the structure, couldn't demolish it, and couldn't find a single commercial buyer. Stuck with a property she despised and facing mounting legal fees and property taxes, she was forced to sell. But the market for a historically protected house with strict preservation covenants is small. There was only one person who saw its true value, and who had the skills and the love to be its proper custodian. 6 months later, through a lawyer, I bought my home back for a fraction of its market value. Just enough to cover Carol's legal debts and get her out of my life forever. I walked through the front door, not as a visitor, but as the keeper of a legacy. The house was quiet, waiting for me. I ran my hand along the great oak beam in the living room, feeling the strength not just of the wood, but of the history it held. I had learned that the most powerful weapon against greed isn't a hidden trick or a secret flaw. It's the truth of what something is truly worth. Some people only know the price of things, but they never understand their value. Thank you for listening to my story. It's a reminder that even when things seem their darkest, the truth has a way of coming to light, sometimes in the most unexpected places.